disrupting nature of cyber with regards to modern societies. As we all know, the world's becoming increasingly interconnected, and with the rapid growth of digitalization, we're also experiencing an increase in malevolent actors aiming to exploit the infrastructure on which we rely for almost every aspect of our lives. And I can see I'm going to have to hold this right up here, so thank you for reminding me about that, sir. And if at any point I or anybody else in my panel can't be heard, please just raise a hand. It's oh, yes, or put it to your ear as you did, because there's absolutely no point in being here if you can't hear the words of wisdom that will be coming from this platform. So really, I'm not going to pretend to any specialist knowledge on this subject myself. I'm here really, I think, to ask the sort of very simple questions of our panel, which is, you know, what are the threats and what are you guys doing about it? So let me just tell you who we have got here. Stephen Wilson here is head of the European Cybercrime Centre, that's EC3 of Europol, which is the multinational European policy organisation. Chelsea Stack, along at the end there, is Deputy Head of the Cyber Defence Section with the international staff at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Mark Smitham, along at the end there, is Senior Manager of Cybersecurity Policy at Microsoft, who's kindly stepped in to replace Mark Moss, who's been called away at the last minute. And Hans de Vries, head of the National Cybersecurity Centre of the Ministry of Justice and Security of the Netherlands. So a very experienced, high-powered panel covering a number of areas where cyber issues are of concern and are being tackled. Please do take a note of questions that you might want to ask as we go along. I'm very keen that this is as interactive a session as possible. Our panelists are not here to talk at you, but to start by just giving you an idea of where they see the threats and where their organisation is operating, and then we very much want to hear from you at that point. So can I start then, Hans, if we start at the state level, the Netherlands state in your case, where do you perceive the threats and how are you tackling them at that level?
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me? Good. My name is Hans de Vries. I'm head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is the coordinating body in the Netherlands for cyber crisis on a state and critical infrastructure nature. What we do is we try to make sure that when there is a crisis, we deal with it accordingly. And in the pretext that there is no crisis, but we find information that is crucial for those organizations, we make sure that we make sure that the information is there for them to use. We make reports every year showing what are the difficulties that we face. And what we've seen in the last few years is that state actors and criminal organizations are really taking advantage of all the issues in the IT sector. It's too easy to misuse. If I would have chosen a different job, probably have earned a lot more money if I'd gone in the criminal business. But having said that, we really have to tackle that because it has a huge impact, sometimes even collateral damage if something happens abroad, but it hits the Netherlands at the same time. For simply, cybersecurity is borderless. The moment it hits, it can hit everyone at the same time. Therefore, international cooperation is crucial. Not only within Europe, but broadly over all borders in the same time. And my organization is dealing with those talks at the same time to make sure that we have a good vision of what's happening in the Far East, what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in the United States, because it can happen to us in 10 minutes' time.
Thank you very much. And as you'll see, these are introductory comments from our panelists, and we'll be able to tease out more of what their organizations do in the course of this session. But Mark, from a private industry point of view, Microsoft, where do you see the threats and the challenges and indeed the solutions?
Thanks very much. One of the things to pick up on is cyber attacks aren't just borderless. They also happen predominantly more and more on civilian infrastructure. So at that stage, when Microsoft is a hyperscale cloud provider operating one of the 3 largest private networks in the world, and providing services to citizens worldwide, when a cyber attack occurs, it happens on our infrastructure. And not just Microsoft's infrastructure, it also happens on quite a lot of our peers and our partner organizations as well. Therefore, Microsoft is involved in trying to invest over $1 billion a year in order to defend our systems. We don't just make that as a simple investment. It's also from the perspective of the tools and techniques that we use to identify the type of attacks. One of the things that we operate is a digital crimes unit, which takes in scans of millions of emails a day. And because if our customers are using Windows 10 with advanced threat protection and Windows Defender enabled, there are potentially millions of endpoints providing us with trillions of pieces of information daily, which means we're able to do analytics through artificial intelligence analysis and machine learning techniques to better identify the types of behaviors from state-sponsored actors or from other forms of cyber attack. So that's the difference between considering this on an individual or a national scale where the threats are coming from everywhere, but the information that's available in the private sector. And that's where private sector and public sector partnership do really go hand in hand. Something to add into the mix is there are a lot of initiatives that talk about ways to improve cybersecurity overall. There's the Global Coalition for Cyber Expertise. There's also the Tech Accord, which is an organization of over 40 different companies trying to do more. They're all trying to do very similar things. What we'd like to see is something more cohesive, where everything's joined together under some key principles, considering the range of attacks that we've been talking about. There are some challenges for the future, because we can only do so much in partnership. One of the concerns is governments stockpiling vulnerabilities in order to develop cyber weapons. And we'd like to see some transparent principles around how governments should be doing that in the future. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Steve, in a past life, you were a Scottish policeman, and now you're at Europol. What's your perspective on all this?
I know, ladies and gentlemen, this is unique, having 2 Scots people on the one panel speaking the world's only encrypted language. But from a European perspective at Europol, we are a European intelligence agency for policing. We put all the information into the central pot. And what Hans and Mark have just said about looking at that European and increasingly global picture is hugely important. But for my initial opening, I'm going to speak about when I thought it was going to go completely wrong. May the 12th last year, WannaCry. I was sitting in the office. We started to get phone calls, the UK, Spain, Portugal, Germany. In the UK, the National Health Service was shutting down. I personally had friends who were due to go in for an operation. Everything was cancelled. How somebody didn't die from that, I don't know. Germany, the rail network started shutting down. In Spain, the telecoms network started going down. This is the global reach. With WannaCry, we were exceptionally lucky. There was a particular kill switch brought into place that stopped the spread of that going where it could have gone. But that, for me, is the starting point. And what appears to be a civilian attack then becomes much more serious, and we start getting into the top end. A month later, NotPetya, we saw again something masquerading as a piece of ransomware, wiping records. I spoke to senior officials in Maersk, the shipping company. They lost 149 out of 150 of their countries. They didn't know where anything was in the world. Any container, any ship, where it was going, who it belonged to. That started to gum up ports, transport, rail links, leading to the potential breakdown of society. What else have we seen? Denial of service attacks, where people are bombarding websites to shut them down. Now, bad enough when it's shutting down major parts of industry, but the country of Liberia at one point was knocked offline. What does that mean to you, ladies and gentlemen, when all of a sudden you can't access anything? Because that does happen, and bringing us to the top level, probably the worst situation I've seen with the black energy attack in Ukraine. Obviously, significant political problems ongoing at that point. What happens when your television goes off? Your smartphone stops working. You've got no transport, you've got no power whatsoever. That's when panic sets in. And that, for me, is the challenge we are now facing in the cybercrime world. What started off as a hacktivist, a script kiddie, an organised crime group, now could be a nation state, because we see the capabilities in cyberspace range across all of these different areas. And that's a huge challenge for myself, my colleagues, and with industry as well.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, NATO. Chelsea, give us that perspective.
Thank you, Sally. And before I begin, thank you very much for the invitation to be here, to Carnegie and also to Europol for organizing this panel. It's really great to be here. NATO leaders recently met in Brussels for a summit. And here they recognized that cyber threats to the security of the alliance are becoming more frequent, complex, destructive, and coercive, and that NATO will continue to adapt to this evolving cyber threat landscape. In a speech earlier this spring in Paris, the NATO Secretary General observed that nowhere is the fog of war thicker than it is in cyberspace. Defending ourselves is no longer just about looking at a map and deciding where to place armies. We see the use of cyber tools as tools for political influence, gone from being tools of espionage or theft of intellectual property, now to affecting the societies that we live within as a potent tool of hybrid warfare. For nearly 70 years, the mission of NATO as a political military alliance has been collective defense. That is, the 29 allies of NATO committing to defend one another. And that principle now applies in cyberspace, which is why NATO's been working with over 40 partner countries, other international organizations such as the European Union, as well as with our friends in industry and academia to tackle this threat. And I'll go into some of the initiatives later, but I'd like to leave you with 3 particular aspects that we've been working on at NATO. The first is to reinforce our collective defense and deterrence. So that's investing in our capabilities. NATO has a defensive mandate. We protect our own networks, we help our individual allies increase their resilience, and we operate now increasingly in this domain. So boosting the defenses of NATO as an organization, in 2016 we recognized cyberspace as a domain of military operations. And we've been rethinking the way that we plan, the way that we train, and the way that we exercise, mainstreaming cyber aspects into the debate. And just recently at the Brussels summit, NATO leaders decided to set up a new cyberspace operations center, which will once again help to coordinate our operational activity in cyberspace. So the first pillar, NATO defense, strengthening that aspect. The second, our allies. And here resilience is absolutely key. And the Cyber Defense Pledge, which was adopted by all NATO leaders in 2016, saw allies increasing their efforts to strengthen and protect their national networks and infrastructures as a matter of priority. 2 years on, I'm happy to report that all allies are progressing in this area. Third pillar, partnership. At NATO, we like to say that cyber defense is a team sport, and it's true. To give you an example, during the 2017 WannaCry incident, we quickly reached out to allies as well as our friends in industry and at the European Union. And the information exchanged was critical for getting the most up-to-date picture of a very rapidly evolving situation. With our friends at the EU, we're working increasingly on looking at how do we do crisis management? What are the cyber aspects? Considering that most of the inherently destabilizing activity we see in cyberspace falls below the threshold of armed conflict, or Article 5, NATO's traditional raison d'être. Lastly, while NATO doesn't set norms, it's important to try to prevent these incidents from happening in the first place. which is why we welcome the work that's ongoing in other fora, such as at the UN in a group of governmental experts, or at the OSCE on confidence-building measures, to try to reduce the risk and to promote stability in this place. So I think more broadly, you've been given a snapshot as to NATO increasing defense, increasing resilience among allies, and how we work with partners, all in a spirit of trying to promote this norms-based, predictable, and secure global cyberspace that we all need it to be. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I think you've brought us onto the territory that actually this three-day conference is about, is peace building. And, you know, as soon as you mentioned the fog of war there, you realize the territory that we're in here. This is all part of global peace we're talking about here. So I wonder from that perspective, if you could share a little bit more on what your organizations are doing and how it relates to issues of conflict prevention and so on. If we start with you, Steve.
Yeah. Again, looking at it from the law enforcement perspective, we are all about bringing that intelligence together from a law enforcement starting point, but also working closely with our partners, cybersecurity centres, and most importantly, probably with industry, because industry have got resources that law enforcement will never be able to access, and how we work with them, and specifically Microsoft. Mark mentioned the Digital Crime Unit. We work very closely with them. A recent case, Andromeda, one of the largest criminal botnets in the world, we worked for 2 years with Microsoft, not just to take this down, but to actually arrest the key people behind that. Because that's a huge challenge for us in the cyber world, this attribution. And it brings us back to this threat and how do we achieve peace. When we start an investigation, we don't know whether that's a spotty teenager, organised crime, or a nation state. But that's where you've got to do your investigation properly so you can understand, you can attribute. But ultimately, where we are now with the EU, we have developed the EU diplomatic toolbox, which allows us to respond in a non-military way with either statements or ultimately taking sanctions against countries or individuals or groups who are perceived to be mounting cyber attacks. And so, Alex, back to that whole point of how do we cooperate to actually ensure peace?
And well, how do you cooperate, and how do you cooperate, you know, beyond the EU?
Okay, so
where we might find Britain very shortly.
Yeah, exactly. A sore point for me as a Brit as well. But where we stand with that, at Europol, we've got representatives from the 28 member states, but we've also got another 18 countries are permanently based at Europol. It is sovereign state within Europol, so I can walk from a German desk to the Polish desk to the US desk to the Canadian desk. That is how we join the dots in international investigations, and really more so than in any other crime type, organised crime and CT, cybercrime takes that international cooperation.
Thank you. Mark was mentioning that he feels that there should be more transparency by the states themselves. Am I right, Mark?
That's a good summary, yeah.
How would you respond to that? I think you said they were protecting their vulnerabilities, stockpiling their vulnerabilities.
Stockpiling vulnerabilities. So the analogy that's often given is stockpiling nuclear weapons. Except the thing is, a nuclear weapon can sit in a silo, and you know where it's been launched, who launched it, and where it's going. In cyberspace, cyber weapons are not always so clear. So, for example, quite a lot of the speakers have already mentioned WannaCry and NotPetya. It actually came originally from a vulnerability in Windows XP operating system, which was designed in the 90s and not designed to be connected to the internet all the time with millions of devices worldwide, was not designed to defend itself against state-sponsored attacks with their resources and their expertise and capabilities. Nevertheless, the US government identified a vulnerability, kept it to themselves in their stockpile of software vulnerabilities. Specifically, it was called Eternal Blue. Unfortunately for them, it was leaked or stolen, and then was changed, adapted, weaponized, and then released by different people through the supply chain, different actors. So you can see that it's not the same analogy as a traditional weapon. Cyber weapons are very, very different. And what we'd like to see is a lot more transparency in the processes that governments go through, the decision making that they take to review a vulnerability that has been identified and for them to make a decision of whether or not it's equitable for them to keep this or to disclose it to the vendor appropriately. Because otherwise we see when it's released, it's collateral damage. One of the examples that Steve didn't mention is in the Ukraine, when all of these other victims were being hit by WannaCry and NotPetya. Nearly, I think it's 9/10 of the cashiers in all supermarkets in Ukraine went offline. All the ATMs across the entire of Ukraine went offline. You can't get money and you can't buy any food. That cannot last in a nation state for a long period of time. That is a sustained attack. It was very serious, and we worked very hard together with victims in order to try and make sure they were able to get back online as soon as possible. But it happened because there was a lack of transparency, specifically in this example on behalf of the US government. And we'd like to see more transparency in government's decision-making processes.
Presumably there are constraints against transparency, or else you'd all be opening your books immediately on that.
Well, from my role within the Dutch government, my focal point is to close the loopholes that there are. For we try to make sure that the internet is the next day a bit safer than the day before. So that's why we really focus on coordinated vulnerability disclosure, meaning that you want to make sure that if you find a vulnerability within certain areas, you make sure with the vendor that it is closed before it's made public, so no one can make use of it. So my organization is really focusing on that part. I can understand that from different, let's say, countries, organizations, that they're stockpiling. I cannot say anything about the Netherlands for that, because I'm not in a position to see or to be in that process, because the moment I get them, I close them. Having said that, and looking at the peace building conversation, I'd like to add that the only way we can make forward is we bring everyone up to speed. So from the Netherlands point of view, we don't only look at the Netherlands as an organization, but we look at it as a global mechanism, global initiative to make sure that each country understands cyber better than they do now, making sure that they have a strategy, making sure that they have a kind of a computer emergency response team, so when it hits that country, they can stay up. And we do that very much in combination with the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, because we feel very much that if I can help my neighbors, in the end, I will be a little bit better off at the same time. I see my colleague from Portugal, I see others, and what you see is cooperation both with governments and private organizations is crucial to make sure that we get over the whole mechanism. And I can understand from Microsoft's perspective, and perhaps even a general perspective, that transparency is an essential part of that, and we'll see how the future goes. What's very needed at the same time are cyber norms that are being upheld. And sadly, what you see in the world today is that those cyber norms are moreover stepped on than being used.
Chelsea, the impression that those of us who don't know very much about it get is that the good guys, if you like, are always one step behind. They're always struggling to catch up. To what extent is that true? And to what extent is NATO actually ready for what the next step might be in some of these really kind of dangerous areas we've been hearing about?
No, thank you, Sally. Well, I think as in everything, there's a balance, and we do the best that we can, given a difficult situation where you are dealing with very rapidly evolving technologies that are cheaper to acquire, easier to use, and quite frankly, there's not the constraints that some have. It's a more of an asymmetric space in that sense. So indeed, it is difficult to keep a handle on all of those aspects, if you like. Also, given the fact that from a military perspective, in the past, in more conventional domains such as missile defense, you would have a smaller circle sitting around the table. You would buy a piece of equipment or a weapon system, and you might maintain it over years, but it wouldn't be evolving so quickly. And not only that, but you wouldn't be necessarily relying on civilian infrastructure or even operators to maintain that. So in that sense, it's a shift in mindset, if you like, from broadening the circle, of widening the circle. How do you work with the private sector, given they are the ones that own and operate the majority of networks? They're the ones that you call in a crisis. Not only that, they're the ones that are developing your innovation for the future. So initiatives such as the NATO Industry Partnership has been very important for NATO in changing that mindset, if you like, to work in this space. Also working with other international organizations, the European Union has been key in helping to increase our preparedness as we look at, I was mentioning, the spectrum below Article 5, which is the traditional space, if you like, of an organization such as NATO. So how do we share best practices on crisis management? How do we exchange information more quickly? And here, a couple years ago, we signed a technical arrangement between the computer emergency response teams of NATO and the EU precisely to be more prepared, to try to get a step ahead so that you're only a call away as opposed to going through bigger bureaucracies that we traditionally come to know. So I think in general, the key here in remaining where we are, in trying to see what's coming next, is the partnership factor, which we've already discussed, is the resilience piece about trying to harness as many resources as possible across the government and across international organizations so that we have a better picture of what's going on and we're better able to respond. And in essence, I think that's what we're trying to do at NATO, and it's a work in progress and will continue.
Okay, I'd like to get your comments and questions now. My colleague Robert is going to dash around. Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel. I wanted to touch on something that just was mentioned about creating norms.
Can everybody hear?
Closer.
Is it not?
Yeah, that's
there
better.
we go?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on something that the panel mentioned about creating norms in cyberspace and the difficulty of that. And I had noticed that Microsoft was trying to lead this digital Geneva Convention initiative. And I was wondering if you could speak to the difficulties in getting different actors signed up to that convention, whether in the private sector or also, NGOs or governments even backing that that effort, and then maybe broadly across the panel how you see these norms emerging, and how are, let's say, Russia and China inevitably going to be on the opposite side of those norms. How do we work with them as well?
Okay, Mark.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. So just in case nobody's ever heard of the Digital Geneva Convention, it was an idea that Microsoft made public and advertised around about April last year, and it caused quite a lot of interest worldwide. The main reason being, and particularly in a building like this, it's wholly inappropriate to talk about a Geneva Convention without accepting and realizing all of the loss that was leading up to the development and the measures taking place to produce a Geneva Convention in the first place. Just putting the word digital in front of it is not helpful. However, diplomatic norms in cyberspace are nothing new. This conversation has been running for long before 2016. In fact, they're 10, 12, 20 years old. And therefore, we wanted to escalate the conversation. We wanted a lot more attention. And at the time, a decision was taken to use that particular brand. We don't talk about that anymore. It's not appropriate for us to do so because of the points that you've just made. It's not always just about the nation states getting involved, and diplomatic measures, the space that Chelsea was mentioning below the point of armed conflict and where a resolution may be taken to respond with a kinetic attack in the form of defense. It's appropriate to include the private sector. And therefore, that's why I was talking about some principles between all these initiatives and collaboration that we have. It was quite mean of me to force the point and talk about transparency with a member state government who we work very cooperatively with, because there are quite a lot of other initiatives where we do work collaboratively developing new steps. But we do need to include the private sector in these kinds of principles as well. That's the reason why Microsoft worked together with our industry partners to set up the Tech Accord. And you can find a lot more information about how that's progressing. It's now involving 40 different companies and getting larger all the time, where there is an agreement on the principles of activity and defense in cyberspace in the private sector. The example that I gave talking about a cyber weapon that can change hands all the way through the supply chain to the point where it's weaponized as opposed to deployed, it's very difficult to see the accountability across that supply chain. And therefore, to complement these binding agreements in diplomatic norms for what would be appropriate behavior in cyberspace from state actors, we're also talking about an NGO, the type that if we have a Geneva Convention as a result of the atrocities that we saw leading up in the world wars leading up to the development of those conventions, then at the same time there was the International Committee for the Red Cross to try and establish what could be done beyond the state, beyond the private sector. And therefore in cyberspace we'd like to see something similar to complement it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Did you want to come in? Yes, please.
Just to add to the debate, in 2014, all NATO allies recognized that international law applies in cyberspace. So it's not the wild, wild west in that sense. Perhaps there could be further debate, further discussion on the specificity of how to apply international law. But NATO allies have been very clear, and this follows on the report from the UN Group of Governmental Experts that itself confirmed that international law applies in cyberspace. And I just point to efforts, indeed the private sector, an important voice in the conversation, as well as academia and international legal scholars. And here the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn facilitated a study on how international applies, both in peacetime and in conflict. And they're called the Tallinn Manual. And it was, if you like, not a binding piece of state doctrine or even NATO doctrine, but a contribution by legal scholars sitting down and going through these tough questions about international law as applies in this space. So we welcome the debate in this area. We know it's actively unfolding, and indeed, it does need to involve all stakeholders around the table.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's have your question, sir. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Ortiz. I'm a jurist and legal advisor in public international law. First of all, I want to thank all of you for your wonderful, if somewhat terrifying, insights. I'm curious what your thoughts are on cyber attacks and cybersecurity and what role they have to play in the interpretation of core international crimes such as war crimes, the crime of aggression, crimes against humanity. Is it your opinion that we need to look at these definitions, which were drafted over the course of 60 years and many atrocities, and relook at them and how technology and cybersecurity and cyber attacks are going to fit within those paradigms? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. Yeah. Hans, any thoughts? Do we need to redefine our ancient definitions of war crimes?
I'm not really educated enough to give a clear answer. What I do see is that the IT sector shook the world. So we hardly have any analog mechanisms left. So we're so stuck within the digitalization of our completely society that responsibilities definitely are changing. And I'm not sure whether it would mean that in the core the law has to change, but you have to take into account that the world definitely has changed a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can maybe pick up briefly on that one. Yeah, I think you're completely right. If you look at the legal principles across just Europe, many times we're operating on 18th, 19th century legal principles. We're dealing with 21st century technology. That does not compute. I was trying a few weeks ago to explain cryptocurrency to a judge. Sometimes things just don't work well together, putting it in conventional terms. But I think what's happening, to come back to the industry strike, what's happened, I think technology is driving change. This change is going on at a pace that policy, regulation and law cannot keep up with. And I think that's the huge challenge. But bringing back to what we have here, with The Hague, with the whole idea of the city of peace and justice, to me, there's a perfect opportunity to base something like that here, to look at the emerging threat, challenges, and how do we actually regulate that in this world.
Yeah, so you need an actual body to look at these legal questions and the definitions. Yeah, thank you.
Can I add one thing? Well, now we're talking about people or countries or organizations who are misusing probably situations within hardware or software. But don't forget the manufacturers themselves, that they have their own responsibility at the same time to produce goods in essential safe. I mean, we have so many discussions. For instance, if you take IoT, the verb we say, the S in IoT stands for security, meaning it's not there. I mean, and it's not there. And you see so many different articles being produced, like a kettle boiler on the internet while you're standing next to it. Why do you want to put it into the internet in the first place? It's a big question to me. But the fact that we are hundreds and hundreds of billions of articles like that putting on the internet, the biggest attack on our infrastructure happened through CCTV cameras. And we're producing them by the bundles every day in an unsafe way. So we're creating our own havoc here if producers don't take up the responsibility. Microsoft is, all right? But there's so many other countries who don't take up the responsibility, organizations and producers who, well, try to make the big buck or the quick buck, or it's too difficult so I don't put it in. Standards password like 1111 and you cannot change it. I mean, that's dangerous.
So is that also then a failure of the law to keep up and the regulatory systems?
I think the regulatory system completely, Internet of Things is a really well-made point. What it comes down to is price point. People are trying to put things onto the market as cheaply as they possibly can, and often security is the first thing that goes. That's where the responsibility, I think, of governments, of industry is to say there is a minimum standard. That's where we can turn to the Microsoft and say, design something to this level.
So who are the regulators then? Who's responsible for this?
We don't have that international body. If you look in the European side of things, there's a movement now for ENISA, the European Network and Information Security Agency, to have a pan-European regulatory ability to say, this is a standard. But you try to actually impose that across Europe, it's a massive challenge. You try to do that on a global basis, I don't know if it's possible.
Well, may I add on a thing? In the Netherlands, we're working on a national roadmap for safe hardware and safe software. So we're taking up our responsibility to make sure that within the Netherlands, goods are produced and being used in a safe manner. We also work closely together with ENISA to make sure that on a European level, that same setup is going to happen. We even go beyond. I was last week in Singapore. And the Netherlands and Singapore are trying to set up a mechanism for IoT to make sure that, and on a global mechanism, the way forward for the newest IoT stuff is being produced in a safe manner. So we're really stepping up to make sure that there is going to be a global initiative, not only from a country perspective, but from a global initiative to make sure this is the road forward. So I think there are possibilities. We stick our neck out. It's very important for all of us.
Yeah.
But it is somewhat alarming to know that there is no regulatory body across the world that can. I don't know. Perhaps we have
working on kind of a certification question, but it's very difficult to within software. It can be changed the next day. So what did you certify?
Yes.
Yeah, so there might not be a central body responsible for enforcement of cybersecurity issues. However, when you pare it down to the point that Chelsea was making, is quite often existing a law can be applicable. It enters into a conversation about product liability and duty of care, which already exists, whether it's a car or a kettle or whatever. There are certain safety standards and measures that have been put in place in existing legislation, and there is an argument how much of that should apply now. We end up into talking about the specificities again. I'd like to go back to the point you were making around the majority or the largest attack came from the CCTV cameras, yeah, is a great example, and I have to talk about that because of the remark that you made where maybe it's not always existing law which can be applicable. Maybe we do need new definitions and things like this. However, one of the examples from Microsoft's perspective in this particular field is through our digital crimes unit and working with Europol. Our digital crimes unit is an interdisciplinary team of technical experts, law enforcement expertise, as well as legal expertise. Because if we see an attack happening, all of these connected devices, in this case CCTV cameras, we cannot just turn it off. Because law applies. We're not allowed to just redirect traffic on the internet. That's illegal. You're not allowed to tap or reroute telephone calls and so on and so forth. And therefore, we can't do that with internet traffic, even when an attack is taking place and we can see that it is happening. However, where there is this type of attack taking place using our product, our software, then a very old piece of law became applicable. And we used an example where we are a farmer and the product, in this case software, running on the CCTV cameras, a low-level version of Windows 10 IoT, which is available, it is considered in legal terms as a cow. And the cow has gone onto somebody else's territory, and therefore it is in someone's way, it's not their cow, and they hurt the cow. But it's still our property, and according to a 17th century piece of legislation, we have the right to try and defend our property and make sure our cow is fine. And therefore, our DCU team used that in the US for justification to take down a botnet saying we are protecting our property as a result of this activity. So it's not clear cut.
You do feel it's time for the cows to be upgraded a bit, don't you, for the
yes.
21st century?
Perhaps.
Now, can we have another question? We have a lady here.
Yes.
Okay.
The microphone over there.
I was looking for a bit of gender balance, that's all. But no, carry on if you've got it, sir. That's fine.
It's gone.
Oh, it's gone. Sorry.
Amazing.
Okay, then. I first want to say thank you for offering your insights. I'm not an expert on cybersecurity matters, but my question relates more to the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy issues. You'd mentioned, the gentleman from Microsoft mentioned that on a given day, 10 million or millions of emails are analyzed by artificial intelligence. And that strikes in me potentially, depending on who is requesting that information, potentially the violation of legal rights, but also a violation of privacy rights. So I'm wondering what the protocol is in that regard, and at the same time, when tracing cybersecurity attacks, what the broader respect for privacy rights is across the board.
Yeah.
I'll take part of that one, and I think that privacy versus the rights of victims is at the crux of this. So I'm a huge supporter of privacy. We made a joint statement in relation to Europol, not advocating backdoors, etc. The problem I face on a daily basis is terrorist cases, some of the most horrendous child abuse cases you ever see, and how do we protect, should we protect the privacy of people who are transgressing conventional human rights to the extent that people are either dying or children are being recurrently abused. And the problem, as I see sometimes with the encryption challenge, is that I cannot catch paedophiles who are running actual forums where their membership of that forum is predicated upon uploading new content on a weekly basis. That's the huge, and I know that's the emotive argument. I think there needs to be a balance struck between the right to privacy, but then if somebody goes beyond what society accepts as reasonable, then there's a right on the law enforcement side to target that. I don't advocate the national intelligence side where it's a bulk capture. I am highly focused. If Stephen Wilson is a bad guy abusing children, I should be able to point everything at law enforcement at him.
Thank you.
So just to take your question on email scanning. So we don't read the emails, we don't read the content of the emails. It's about the telemetry of the email, where it came from, the IP addresses and things like that. We operate very differently in order to observe the right of privacy of our customers. It's one of the most fundamental points about Microsoft. It's not within our principles or our ethical decision making in order to go and do that. Our business model is different. We don't run advertising through email services. However, one of the things that we do in order to observe that while still keeping customers safe, because a piece of behavior that does happen is phishing. There's a link inside the email and somebody clicks on it. So we don't read the email to see that the link is there and what it is before you've read it, but there's that action of clicking on that link. And that triggers a sandbox environment that goes to a SafeLinks web address where we do the analytics afterwards. So that's what I mean by scanning the emails. It's a long drawn out process of going into it, and that's the reason why I didn't mention it in detail to begin with.
Did you have a point you wanted to add to that?
No, I have a different question.
Oh, it's a different...
Can I add one more thing?
We're gonna
My job is to make sure that when someone is in a difficult situation because their machine is tampered with or their email is scammed or whatever, to inform them as soon as possible. And the privacy laws in itself make it sometimes even difficult for me to reach to those people. The GDPR gives me the possibility, and the legal boundness within the Netherlands give me a possibility to give all lots of information to within the EU and the Netherlands. But outside of EU, it's very difficult for me to cooperate with certs at the same level because I'm hampered of dealing and giving out an IP address because it's being seen as a privacy issue. While at the same time, I cannot help the person behind that because the privacy question stops me on that. So sometimes I'm really looking forward to find the right balance, and I don't think the right balance is there yet.
Sorry, I'm going to take that away from you. Apologies, because I thought you wanted just to add to that point because the lady over here has been waiting for ages, but we'll come back to you, sir, for that question.
We're here till 6, I think. So,
We're going to be here for hours. I've been listening very carefully, and I don't believe that any of you have touched on this so far. I think that one of the main threats to peace, as we're at a peace-building conversation, is, and what can be identified potentially as cybercrime, is the spreading of misinformation and fake news over the internet, with the aim particularly to promote responses to that. Certain countries, I'm not naming names, are reported to already use these tactics as a new weapon in war between the states, as a way of destabilizing regimes and governments. These are cyber wars that have no beginning or end. We don't say, oh, this began on such and such a date and will end then. There's also the issue of micro-targeting of particular populations via big data. So this is where big data is used in the bad way rather than the good way, as we've been hearing over the past couple of years, particularly thinking about organizations like Cambridge Analytica that's been in the news a lot. How do we counter this rapid rise of different types of conflict engagement and build global peace rather than discord, and counter the lurch to the right and the rise of populism? That's something that I think we should be taking seriously when we're talking about cyber.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting question, and lots of different aspects to that. I mean, Chelsea, and we know the nation state that we're mainly talking about here. What's the NATO response to fake news on a state level?
Well, I mentioned in the introductory, and that's a great question. I mentioned in the introductory remarks this move from more traditional forms of interstate conflict precisely to this more population-centric tools of influence and that really permeates all facets of society. So you're now not only protecting critical infrastructures or this set of troops or this submarine, but I'm trying to protect society, if you like. And who does that? Is it the military? Is it the private sector? Is it the media? Is it governments? And in short, it's all. And that's the challenge, really, that we're dealing with. So at NATO, per se, dealing with misinformation and kind of that is a national responsibility. So it's up to each ally to tackle that threat. However, as a platform of 29 countries, NATO has adopted a countering hybrid warfare strategy, if you like. So looking at ways to enhance situational awareness, to understand what is going on in different allies. What are you seeing in terms of tactics? In looking at resilience of our systems, so from a more cybersecurity, cyber defense perspective, working with other partners, industry, international organizations. So if you like, it's for nation states to deal with as such. The education and awareness piece is absolutely critical. And at NATO, we're seen as a platform and one that tries to spread best practice about how different allies are dealing with it. And then also, most importantly, work with organizations such as the European Union that have also been doing a lot to enhance national resilience, if you like, of society.
Okay, Mark, we can't really ask you to speak on behalf of, say, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and so on. But to what extent do you think that the private, these big, huge private organisations that have so much power in our lives now are stepping up to their responsibilities to try and counter this?
So it's a very valid question, talking about the difference between information warfare and cyber warfare. Somebody made the question earlier that there are different countries that hold different opinions, and there is that difference in definition between different people's perspective of who accepts this type of misinformation is part of existing cyber warfare scenarios. It is right that the private sector should be involved in order to protect society, and there is a question of whether or not industry is doing enough. The European Commission...
Are they?
No. And that's the reason why Microsoft has launched a Defending Democracy program to better protect politicians and political campaigns from the type of attacks that we've seen through phishing campaigns, specifically targeting people at risk. And also our products, like LinkedIn, has taken the decision to no longer support paid-for advertising by political campaigns or topic-based issues. And also, we're going even further. We've got involved with NewsGuard in order to, an organisation that is set up and founded by journalists in order to review the type of content through websites and newspapers online, so that there can be plugins inside the browser, so that everyday citizens and consumers can see the type of material that they're reading, whether or not it is a reliable piece of content or it is fake news. And we're doing a lot more. That's from the Microsoft perspective. Whether or not other companies and the rest of industry are doing enough, that's an open question, which is why the European Commission launched a code of practice for disinformation this summer. And it still hasn't been published. I think that's going to happen tomorrow.
And is that enforceable?
It's a piece of self-regulatory initiative.
What's
and therefore,
the point of that?
Well, under European legislation, if a business signs up to it, then it becomes liable for the type of activity off the back of it. So that's the value to self-regulatory activities that don't have to have the big hammer of hard law behind them.
What do you think of that, Steve?
I think just going back to the question, I think this is much more about psychology rather than the technical aspect of the internet. And I find that actually more fascinating. Back to the point that Chelsea made, the education process here is fundamental. I think a lot of people now are probably much more aware of what's going on. But bring it back to the technical side, I think that's where the benefits are for artificial intelligence, is identifying these chatbots, the ones that are generating this content and tying it back to single source. Unfortunately for me, it's really not a law enforcement issue for somebody to say, to put out disinformation there. But I totally accept that ultimately this can be the base point of starting to destabilise a government.
So, I mean, the question really boiled down to how do you counter any of this?
Yeah.
Has anybody actually come up with anything that is going to counter it?
Yeah, looking at artificial intelligence, to actually that machine learning, looking at the masses of data out there to identify where this type of disinformation is coming from, to try and shut it down at source.
So, yeah, for example, through our Defending Democracy campaign, Microsoft has identified that 10 political candidates from the Democratic Party in the US have already been targeted by Russian actors. So it is possible to identify not only what the material is, but where it came from as well.
And is NATO really doing enough on this?
Well, as I mentioned, it's the member states themselves as a national. They run the elections. They have their societies which they're responsible for. So for NATO as it's such, it's an issue that we follow. We act as a forum for best practice. We're tackling the issue of hybrid warfare and how to counter this type of warfare and the tools that are often associated at societal level. That we do also in working with the European Union. But I'd like once again to highlight the importance of the awareness raising and the education piece, which really belongs with individual member states.
It's actually something that's really good from the Dutch government, their involvement in the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise and the sheer body of work that's being developed through there in order to increase cyber awareness and education.
Want to tell us any more about that, Hans?
Well, just go to the website. Probably the easiest way. Yeah, it's probably the easiest way. One thing that I want to add is, with the last election, we explained to all the different political parties what cybersecurity was within their own environment, also what the impact would be. Mm-hmm. And that really raised the bar of understanding, not so much about misleading information, but understanding how to deal with cybersecurity in general. Mm-hmm. And that really helped. It really helped.
Thank you very much.
I think that Mr. is at the end.
Yes, there's questions over there. Did you have a question? Yes. Could we have the microphone down here, please?
Sorry, guys.
Sorry, we still have some women to go to balance up here.
Well, the question is regarding exactly education. Yeah. Well, also maybe women in the programs for sure, but we talk always about, or for what I perceived, is always a very high level of education. If we are living as a society in a digital world, we should by now thinking that we need to educate children and re-educate adults to a point of a basic education. You cannot take a car if you don't have a license. You need to go to school and learn everything from geography to history. So you need to learn how to live in a world, and we're not doing the basic steps for generations to understand how to live in a digital world. Yeah. And again, all this awareness programs, and I've been following, they target the politicians, but then again, the ones who are going to vote and have their Facebook with strange videos, they will not be able to have critical thinking that I still think is the massive weapon for attacking what is attacking us. It's critical thinking, no matter if it's fake news or whatever. So my concern and my question to all of you is from the point of view of basic education, what is being done? Or at least how you think you can tackle it. Because a simple introduction of education in basisschool would be quite important.
Yeah, Steve.
Yep, couldn't agree more with you. This education should start, at primary school, simply because it's a fundamental part of society now. In the Netherlands, teach the children to swim at a very age because it's a threat. In Scotland, we teach our kids to ride a bike very early as well. I started a programme in Scotland that's now continuing, actually just at the first year of secondary school, aged 11, whereby we did an advanced 10-week programme for the kids about cybersecurity, how to understand the threat. But the big benefit we did with this as well was if they wanted a merit to get an extra award, they had to go home and work with their parents or their grandparents to put the message across. Now, the beauty was 11 and 12-year-olds get this instinctively. They were sitting with their grandparents and teaching them some of the basics, passwords, antivirus. That, to me, is the type of example. The mistake I think I made there was doing that from secondary school. That should have been primary school. We need to teach our kids. They're going to exist in a digital world we never knew. We need to allow them to survive.
But also, the adults have to exist in a world that they never learned anything about.
But that's where we use the kids to educate the parents and the grandparents.
Yeah.
The coming few weeks, we have the cyber month, right? Yeah. And within the Netherlands, we really focus on that. Last we gave out, 2 years ago, was a Donald Duck. You know, we gave a Donald Duck specifically about IT and cybersecurity measures and measurements. That was really made for kids on primary school. So we're trying to work hard, but the things that you mentioned before when we talked about literacy and that we really have to focus on, I really agree with you.
Yeah.
We really have to work on that. And through the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, and sorry for the advertisement about that, we really focus on, that's one of the programs we're working on. So I'd like to join you for that.
And it's interesting, throughout these 3 days, how often and how many of the questions have come back to education.
Yeah, it is.
And,
it is.
you know, that's,
we really
that's
have to
where
step
we need
up
to work.
On several levels.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I know we've got some, yes, question here and then one behind.
Can I make one last remark about privacy? Because I think I have to add something.
Yes, in the latest...
Sorry, just
before you ask
before...
the question, I have to correct something, because it's in the notes. When I said that we have to make sure that the balance between privacy and cybersecurity is a bit more balanced, what I meant is through the GDPR, I now have to make MOUs with each and every country to make sure that I can share that type of info that keeps their countries or their people safe. So it gives me a lot of burdensome extra work to make sure that I can keep your citizens more safe than ever. So if we make new legislations, let's always think about the digital firemen that we are, that we can still do our work, because now I'm really hampered and it takes probably 2 years before I have 160 different MOUs with many countries so I can do my work again. So that's what I meant with try to get the balance right.
Thank you for clarifying that point. Yes.
In their latest report, Europol...
Right, very close, please.
In the latest report, Europol stated it was very hard to prosecute digital criminals outside EU borders. And you just mentioned that sanctioning states, which both sounds unique as we don't do it in other crimes, and extreme measures. If I ask you, or all of you, what kind of tools and capabilities would you wish to possess to prosecute digital criminals outside EU? And how can the private sector help with you achieving those goals?
So what tools and capabilities would you like to possess?
I think legislatively we have the basis. We work under the Budapest Convention, allows us to transfer information. The problem is we only have 61 countries signed up to that. Other countries will not consider signing up to that at all. That is an immediate barrier for us to try and working on a global basis. On the partnership cooperation, absolutely fundamental to what we are doing. That is why I think we are now starting, in some instances, turning the tables on the cyber criminals and catching some of the top-level gangs, is simply because of that cooperation with industry. They have access to masses of data. They are now putting it into a format that can be read by police. We don't have to wade through hundreds of terabytes of data. We can get something that's much more condensed, focusing, and that allows us to go after the bad guys, because industry cannot arrest. That's our job. But industry are putting things on our plate to assist us to try and tackle that top-level criminality. So as to additional legislation, I would like to see a much more standardised thing on a global basis where we had a level playing field. But the reality is, times 192 countries trying to achieve that is a huge challenge. I think that's why, in Europe just now, we are starting to see things improve, simply because we have got comparatively standardised legislation.
Thanks. Any other thoughts on tools you might wish to possess that you don't have already?
I do think there are two different issues at the same time. I mean, if you look at states, those bandits are trying to stay under the radar. So if we can find them, we have to put them on the radar to make sure that they cannot travel anywhere. If you look at criminals, you'd like to seize the money where they have, to make sure that it's much less lucrative or much difficult for them to enjoy the wealth that they've made. And if they are in Mallorca, we will definitely be able to arrest them, at least Europol and the combination with the FBI, because I have no legal means to arrest people. The only thing that I do is when I see there is an incident, I don't care about attribution. I try to put out the fire. But my colleagues from the intelligence or the police are able to deal with those people. But we have to bring them on more in the open, I think.
Just in the question of partnerships, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you wanted to see more cohesive partnerships, I think is how you, where is the cohesion needed or failing at the moment?
One of the challenges is how specific do you need to get in order to be able to achieve agreement. So going back to the point around certification, there's Siemens Charter of Trust, which is a very prescriptive approach to principles on cybersecurity and how best to approach it. We've taken it from a more principled approach, and that's the reason why our Tech Accord and the overall descriptive principles on how to raise cybersecurity is dramatically different compared to that. There's also the Global Coalition for Stability in Cyberspace. There's also the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise. There's also, and so on and so forth. There needs to be some accepted, agreed approach between all of this. And that's the reason why there's still ongoing work to try and look at a roadmap for peace-building measures in cyberspace and how we can work together.
Is there a role for The Hague here? I mean, do we need we need another body, another centre for this?
So we were talking about the, or I was talking about the International Committee for the Red Cross, and therefore there needs to be a new NGO to be better facilitate. That is one piece of the pillar. But then also talking about the principles, where Chelsea made the very valid point that international humanitarian law applies equally in the real world as it does in cyberspace. And therefore, to complement that approach, there needs to be not just the academic research, but a body of work that better explains an agreement on the specificities of how that should work. How that can be realised, is it the UN or is it something in The Hague, is still an open question. So I do agree with you, in a building like this, it's appropriate to suggest it should be done.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Willem Vos. I'm a professor, I'm a nerd, I'm a teacher, and also dad. And I would like to attach to the questions that were raised about the lawyer's issues. I have no specialty, and about the teaching from the lady up front, where I have some specialty. So let's consider cyber world to be similar, let's say, to driving outside. I mean, as a little kid, you learn to stay on the sidewalk, hopefully. You learn later on, when you grow up, to ride a bike and to stay on the right side of the street. In England, probably on the left side. At 18 or somewhere thereabouts, you take driving lessons, and if you pass and you let the trams in Den Haag take the right of way, you get your driver's license. Still, accidents happen. Okay, if I take the analogy now to the cyber world, okay, there's no driver's license, there's no rules, there's nothing. We let anyone just get around and roam around. And in the equivalent world of drivers, we're expecting Microsoft, let's call them Daimler-Benz, to make the rules together with NATO, which is a real NATO also in the drivers world, together with the police. Well, let's call Europol police. So I would say all the technological aspects are wonderful, and as a nerd I appreciate them, but they're the wrong side of the story. I think we should really start again from what's an equivalent driver's license, or teaching kids to drive on the highway. I mean, one thing I will finish, and then it's up to you. I mean, I look at my students, I look at my colleagues, I look at my friends, and all their ICT habits are a disgrace. They're a mess. I mean, my students' file folders, I mean, I'm responsible for it, it's a mess. After 5 years, no one can read them anymore. Coding, it's horrible. I don't have to start about passwords, dogs' names, whatever.
What is the question?
It's a zoo. So I think there should be an equivalent driver's licenses at various levels on the IT world, and only then you're allowed to take part in the various.
But presumably the problem is that this is, you know, cyber is without borders.
Yes,
and
still,
you know,
I mean,
it's individual states that establish the driving license, for
this
instance.
could also be starting to be regulated from government's side on, of course, with collaboration from NATO and other parties. But you should rather think, I mean, so I'm suggesting we should rather cross-think in another way.
Yeah, if I can I put it a different way? If you would start to regulate and decide who would be able to use certain types of apparatus or internet, how free would it be?
It's the same freedom as driving on the street. You can go to the NATOs.
That's making the comparison whether driving and IT usage is in the same equivalent. I think it's a different league. And communication, if you look, for instance, in publishing books, right? We have in the Netherlands.
Thank you, sir. We've got your analogy. I just want to hear what the panel's saying. Yes.
If you read books, we have a quite liberal mechanism for freedom of speech. But there are countries where the freedom of speech is rather limited. And if there would be applicable to IT, I fear for freedom of mental movement, freedom of creativity and thoughts. And I don't think we ever fathomed that the IT and the digitalization made so many progress and so many things possible. And to be honest, I fully understand that we have to work on some kind of a guidance, but a license would go much too far for me.
That's interesting. Chelsea, what are you writing?
Just to return to the topic of education, and here, what we were trying to do with the Cyber Defense Pledge at NATO is to have a whole-of-government approach to the issue of cyber defense. So it's not just the traditional defense and security-related actors, but when you have a national conversation about cybersecurity, cyber defense, for example, is the Ministry of Education there? In a sense that, how are you developing curricula for universities, for high school students? Some NATO allies have curricula for elementary schools. So as we start to grow with this, I think perhaps it's mainstreaming the cyber aspects into our current educational practice. A lot of industries, they have, for example, before you log on to some computers, you do an awareness course. So looking at then more, if you work at an NGO or a government or etc., in order to have access to your computers, you do a simple awareness course that perhaps sets you the basics of what your corporate policy is for acceptable use. That's applicable to almost all of us if you go to your job and you know the rules of the road, so to speak. So I think more mainstreaming the cyber aspects, getting perhaps non-traditional stakeholders to the table to talk about shaping curricula at all levels of the society is perhaps at least the beginning of the conversation.
But the thrust of that point is that basically it's anarchy. Yeah. When you have rules for the simplest other parts of life, we allow this incredibly important and powerful and potent force to be, without rules and regulations, basically.
If I can just simplify this, if you look, I think cyber is the language of the 21st century. We go to school, we teach our children 1 or 2 additional languages. I would like to see cyber becomes a formal part of the curriculum across the EU first and then the world. Because if we're going to protect our children, they need to understand this. And so I actually accept your point. I would like to see the kids having a computer driving license to say, I'm qualified in basic security. The benefit from that is when they start going into industry, we see 500,000 of a gap in the job supply across the EU in the next 5 years. They go in much more aware of what the benefits are as well as the threats. That's where we capitalise.
Who teaches this stuff, though?
Well, that's a huge problem because, again, in education, many of my colleagues who I know in education have gone to the private sector simply because the wages are higher. If you've got a skill set that's rare, you can move across to that. And that's where the huge gap is. And I think that's where the scope is for industry on a local basis to work with individual schools to put something back in. Because that's what we did in Scotland and it was starting to work.
Mark?
I really like the automobile analogy, asking the question, what should come first, technology or legislation? However, I would not draw the direct analogy to a driving license. The example I give is talking about car safety is seatbelts. The technology existed 40 years before the legislation came in that there should be seatbelts in all the vehicles, in the front and in the back. I grew up without having a seatbelt. I learned to drive with a seatbelt. Now, I would never even consider getting in a car or driving away without everybody in the car having their seatbelt on. That analogy works the same way in cyberspace just as well. Is that originally all these things were connected and they had default passwords and didn't need to be updated. Now technology has progressed to the stage where we are making sure that they can be updated when they are connected and they don't have default passwords. And now we're getting to a stage to try and go for the legislative or soft law self-regulatory approach as well to complement it. That way round, not regulate first.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have, yes, exactly, we have come to the end of our time. I mean, such good questions, really, and I think we've just skimmed the surface, you know, of these really, really sort of difficult and challenging questions of cybersecurity. But I hope you feel, I certainly do feel that I understand some of these issues a bit better now. So. Thank you to our panel. Please join me in thanking them now. I think there's another quick break now, and then you'll be led to your next session.